Pustules erupting on the legs and in the armpits.
Afflictions on the head and vomiting blood.
Apple-sized swellings in the groin.
The wrath of God.
Everyone is dead.
Only 3 days.
Why?
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 The year is 1347, and in England, news arrives from the continent of a horrible new pestilence, a plague that indiscriminately kills men, women, and children. The Black Death has arrived in Europe.
One of the most famous epidemics in history is that of the Black Death, from 1347 to 50. There's never been a modern-day equivalent, and the effects on the society of the world was unprecedented. The Foster scale, created to measure disasters, not just through death tolls, but also emotional stress and physical damage, states that the Black Death was the second worst disaster in history, just after World War II.
The Black Death is scientifically known as plague bacilli, which was transmitted to humans by fleas living on rats. The Black Death originated in China and quickly became mobile, spreading to the city of Kaffa on the eastern borders of the Mediterranean. Kept alive and mobile on contaminated fleas, the Black Death found perfect transportation in medieval shipping, which in turn brought the pestilence to the coastal cities of Venice, Genoa, and Marseille by September 1347.
Those who caught the disease fell victim to the following gruesome symptoms: gangrenous inflammation of throat and lungs, violent pains in the chest, vomiting and spitting of blood, pestilential odour from the body and breath. Buboes, the unsightly black boils, grew in the armpits and the groin of its victims. In some English villages, 80 to 90% of the population perished. Life expectancy decreased to just 23 years.
Whilst the exact amount of the population that the Black Death killed is unknown, it is clear that it had a huge effect. Generations were wiped out, and Hampshire itself was hit particularly hard.
Where the Black Death entered the British Isles has come under much debate. This is because of the rapid pace at which the disease spread. Indeed, some people have suggested that in some areas of Europe, the disease spread at a rapid rate of 1.5 kilometres per day.
Southampton is a strong contender in the debate for where the plague first arrived, due to its strong trading links with the continent and its coastal nature.
Henry Knighton, writing in Leicester, stated that
the most lamentable plague penetrated the coast through Southampton.
Geoffrey the Baker, on the other hand, writes that
the 7th year after it began, it came to England and first began in the towns and ports joining on the seacoasts in Dorsetshire. From there it passed into Devonshire and Somersetshire, even unto Bristol, and raged in such sort that the Gloucestershire men would not suffer the Bristol men to have access to them by any means.
So was Southampton the first entry point of the plague into the British Isles? Well, we'll never really know. But what we do know is that Southampton, because of its prime coastal location, was hit hard by the plague, not only in the 1340s, but for centuries to come.
Society was put under so much strain by the Black Death that people began to disregard their customs through necessity. High death toll of the Black Death meant that new ground had to be consecrated for burial, without the required royal permission.
Bishop Addington of Winchester wrote that
provision should be made that the people of the various parishes may have prompt opportunity for speedy burial.
And in amongst his 1348 register,
with the present increasing mortality, the bishop must provide for the needs of his flock.
But this strain was foretold by travellers and pilgrims travelling back from across Europe with tales of deserted lands and uncomfortable brushes with death. But what did these tales truly mean to the people of the time, and how did they react?
At first, the Black Death seemed like a distant and exotic catastrophe, the other side of the known world, an incomprehensible phenomenon where stories included men with arrows thrown at them from heaven beating down their pride. But as the pestilence neared the shores of England, this distant horror became a reality, and contemporaries sought for ways to justify its existence. Most believed that God was punishing sinners, and this would have been a very believable assumption at the time, when the strength of religion was so much, and also the fact that earthquakes and other natural disasters accompanied this news from the Far East.
Bishop Addington told his parishioners,
sickness and premature death often came from sin,
and joined with other bishops in proclaiming the mortality to be God's disease. In response to this, there was an upsurge in prayer and pilgrimage throughout England. People were hoping that they could stop death in its tracks. Indeed, to many people of the time, this would have been a final reckoning of biblical proportions. However, people started to doubt whether it was simply God punishing the wicked after whole villages and swathes of clergy succumbed to the sickness. Indeed, even the king's daughter died. This situation was directly relevant to Hampshire.
In December of 1347, only 3 clerical positions lay open, but by the following April, this figure had risen to 63. Crippled society, combined with a fear of the unknown, began to turn to alien magics and astronomy to explain why people were dying and to predict who would die next.
These new ideas caused widespread panic as people began to question traditional beliefs. This led to new morbid and gruesome imagery being created as people began to try and rationalise what they had seen. Here at Winchester Cathedral, the heart of the diocese, tomb sculptures such as that of Bishop Fox contrasted the worldly splendours with the spreading horrors of death and decay.
Although not a cause of the Black Death, hygiene levels of 14th century England without a doubt contributed to the fast spread of the disease.
Life was nasty, brutal and short. Malnutrition and poor living conditions created the perfect environment for rats to thrive and only aided the spread of the Black Death. Sanitation was almost non-existent and it was common practice to dispose of waste in the roads.
People would have often collected water from nearby rivers or wells, which was often contaminated. Contemporaries speak of filth running through open ditches in the streets, polluted wells and unspeakable privies, which was the condition shared by most of the social classes.
The lack of hygiene does explain why the Black Death most frequently affected the poor. There was also the problem of overcrowding. The medical profession turned its attention to preventing the increase. Noxious air, or the miasma theory, was deemed to be causing the rapid spread of the plague, and thus efforts to control it were focused in this area. We often hear of herbs, smoke and strong perfumes being used to ward off this pestilential air, but little is known of other recommended measures.
And this often led to the fear of God being prescribed as a protective measure against the Black Death.
The bishops of Winchester were potent figures in medieval society, possessing wealth, status and influence in both the church and state. Because of this authority, people looked to the church in times of crisis. This is evidenced in many documents that still survive today, including the letter that Bishop Eddington wrote. Eddington's Vox in Rama letter stated that on Fridays, in addition to 22 psalms, the monks of St. Swithin's Priory were to process, together with the clergy and the people of the city, through the marketplace, with heads bent down, feet bare and fasting with pious hearts. The processions culminated with a mass at the cathedral. From the cathedral to the square, it is still possible to tread the same ground that those doleful processions once passed. During the start of the plague, the church received more in donations than ever before. This is because many people flocked to the church to offer their prayers in the hope that they would be spared. Many of these prayers were directed towards Saint Sebastian, often regarded as the patron saint of the plague.
Issues of church authority caused conflicts to arise with the local population, for example, over problems of burial issues. Here at Winchester, the local population was anxious of the smells coming from the corpses. Yet the bishop was adamant to extend the cemetery due to the advanced demands caused by the plague. In the end, Eddington had to give in to pressure and establish burial grounds outside of the city.
The Black Death could not have hit Hampshire at a worse time economically. Winchester's cloth industry was bankrupt, and Southampton was struggling to rebuild after the French razed it to the ground in 1338. The few towns that were thriving were still fragile, so when the Black Death struck, they were never able to recover.
Before the plague, Titchfield was a bustling town, with agriculture, tanning, brewing, weaving, and many other professions present. By 1300, it had become a substantial market town.
However, just 50 years later, a staggering 80% of the local population were wiped out by the epidemic. It never regained such economic prosperity.
Part of the problem was that the trade routes also transported the plague, scaring merchants into suspending their business. This issue was compounded as the rich left the towns for the isolated countryside, depriving workmen of a market for their goods. Nevertheless, the plague did benefit some. Agricultural workers' wages soared, with so much of the active population dead or dying, and hamlets like Quob being completely wiped out. Those left could charge more for their service and had more land at their disposal. Others were not so fortunate. These falling land prices and expensive labourers caused aristocratic incomes to fall by 20%.
So did the Black Death really make life worse for those living in Southampton? The vast number of mortalities certainly took its toll upon society. Peasants stopped ploughing their lands, fields became derelict, merchants closed down their stores and ceased to trade, and some, if not all churchmen, stopped offering last rites. Life ground to a halt, and this is evident across all parts of Southampton and Hampshire. Indeed, those living in Titchfield never again saw their community as the rich trading centre it had once been.
For some survivors, the outlook was more positive, with an increase in disposable income and the availability of land. This allowed new enterprises to flourish and led to the 15th century being coined the golden age of the new labourer. For example, in Merton, Hampshire, the land for sheep grazing more than doubled, and this aided the wool industry in England.
Winchester College, built on cheap land in the suburbs, is an excellent example of the blossoming enterprise of the 15th century. Even the college statutes in 1400 cite the pestilence as a main reason for its foundation. However, all the certainties of the High Middle Ages had been swept away.
Those living in the later Middle Ages had a powerful sense of the fragility of success. They knew how easily everything could be taken away from them, and this gloomily hung in the back of minds for generations to come.
Fundamentally, the Black Death increased social mobility, and some have argued this acted as a catalyst for the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, in which political and economic aspirations of the peasantry were cited as the main cause.
Many have now come to the conclusion that it was the population's slow recovery which caused the greatest damage to both medieval Hampshire and England as a whole.
The Black Death is undoubtedly one of the most infamous events of the medieval age, and the widespread death and destruction it caused was unprecedented. Whilst historians cannot be sure of the obscure details of the plague, such as why the pestilence often spread the way it did, it is clear it was much more than a fatal disease that killed millions.
It was ultimately an event that changed the social and political landscape. Although populations would eventually recover, minds remained as plagued as the bodies of the dead, infused with questions of doubt and fear to such an extent that life would never be the same again.